I want to play a game. Let's play a game. Let's pretend that that fifth edition was designed for a specific adventuring day length, a certain number of encounters, and that if you follow that, it will work well. Resource-based characters will run out of resources before the end of the day, so that they end up without resources near the end. And resourceless classes will thereby sort of, you have the effectiveness of the casters going down over time, and the effectiveness of the resourceless casters going up, or like staying even, I suppose. And so there's a point at which they cross, and then the effectiveness is switched, and so both have time to shine. The way that it is sort of assumed to work, and the way that the book seems to suggest that it should work. Let us pretend that it does work that way. It doesn't. Let's pretend. In that case, is it acceptable to have a game with that rigid of an adventuring day, where you have to run 6 to 8 combat encounters every day, or else balance does not work? I would posit that it is not acceptable, that it is bad design, even if you can make it work, which it doesn't. Man, there's voices in here. A lot of people, I would wager most people, play D&D as a sort of story-based combat simulator. Is this everyone? Certainly not. Is it most people? I think so. Where you're going to have a story. I swear, I was not coughing before I started recording. You're going to have a story that justifies the combat scenarios that you get into, the series of fights that take you through the adventuring day. The adventuring day being when you finish a long rest until you have finished the next long rest. That's the adventuring day. And the encounters that you run into over the course of that adventuring day that drain your resources over time. 5e is an attrition game. It is like your ability to get through an adventuring day successfully is based entirely on how you're able to sort of meter out your expenditure of resources over the adventuring day. Because when you finish a long rest, you recover all of your resources. Spell slots, limited use abilities, hit points, most of your hit dice. Not a lot of people realize that you don't actually recover all your hit dice on a long rest. But that's relatively minor. So, how many people actually write their stories or design their campaigns around the idea that every single day the PCs are going to be hitting 6 to 8 combat encounters before they get to rest? I would say close to 0. Like maybe you'll hit that sometimes, but every day, absolutely not. As a result, it tends to ramp up the difficulty when you have fewer encounters. All right, in theory, this should work. You expend more resources in a harder encounter so you can have fewer encounters. The problem being that by the time you expend enough resources to make up for multiple encounters, the encounter has gotten so dangerous that the PCs are likely to actually die. And here's the thing. DMs don't want TPKs, because that's usually the end of the campaign, or at least a reset of the campaign. That's bad. It feels bad for the players, and it's frustrating and difficult for the DM to design around. That is a bad outcome for everybody. No one wants it. The possibility of it, arguably, needs to exist in order to keep the threat up. To sort of dangle the threat of death over the head of the PCs so that they are motivated to try harder and defend themselves and take the combat seriously. This is a reasonable idea. I don't know that I can necessarily leverage a strong argument against it. It is not necessarily the way that I design stories and encounters, but I digress. So you can have 6 to 8 normal encounters a day. Let's pretend that is actually like what it takes to make D&D really work. It doesn't. But like, that's so restrictive. That's super restrictive, right? Like, how many times have you had the one encounter day? I would wager a lot of us have had a lot of one encounter days. It's very easy for a story to justify one encounter in a day. Every time you add another encounter to the day, unless you are running a dungeon, and I'll get to dungeons in just a moment, unless you are running a dungeon, you're probably doing 1, maybe 2 encounters in a day. Because that's what the story naturally supports. That's the way that you can, logically justify having a few fights in a day. If you're running a dungeon, before I get to that, so the game should support the way that stories usually play out, right? Because it's a story-based game. It's a role-playing game. You're telling a story. In this story, there are going to be fights, but there's not going to be a long gamut of fights all the time. So that is poor design from the get-go, even if you can make it work mathematically, and it doesn't work. Even so, it's not great design. So the adventuring day is flawed from the get-go for that reason. Now, if you are running a dungeon, you have a much greater ability to justify multiple combats in a day. The issue then is, how do you keep the players from taking too many rests? And there's myriad ways you can handle this. There's literally hours of YouTube content, thousands of words or tens of thousands of words of articles that sort of help DMs figure this out, how to run dungeons and how to manage dungeons especially, and how to handle these sort of what you might call exploitative behaviors, doing one fight and then retreating, one fight and then retreating. That can be an issue. It is a solvable issue. So I think what I'm guessing is that 5th edition was designed with the dungeon in mind. And it was really not designed to support any other type of play other than dungeon delving. So you go to a dungeon and you fight monsters, you fight monsters, you fight monsters, you fight monsters. And then at a certain point, either you finish the dungeon or you retreat or hole up somewhere and rest. So there needs to be some impetus for resting at the right time rather than as soon as the spellcasters start to get a little thin on resources. But you don't want to prevent them from resting when they really need it, which is really hard to design. And I think probably there should be more literature in, like, official literature in, like, the Dungeon Master's Guide on how to structure dungeons in this way. And that actually is why I run a lot of mini dungeons that can be done in one go, because resting in the middle of a dungeon is awkward, no matter the system. It's hard to justify narratively, and if you do it at anywhere other than exactly the right time, it can really just invalidate. Like, you end up going into the end of the dungeon too strong, or you end up like overexerting yourself. It's just super hard to balance. And so I usually don't do it. I do 1 session dungeons, or one adventure day dungeons. So the adventuring day is flawed from the get-go. Even if you assume that the math works out, it doesn't work with most people's stories, and it's awkward for larger dungeons. And so, like, what is even the purpose of it? I would posit that it is a better way to design a game if you don't assume any particular length of adventuring day, and you make it so that every encounter is roughly as difficult as a party can handle using no daily resources. If things go poorly, if, bad rolls happen, or there's a surprise round, some monster gets a lucky crit, things go poorly, then you start spending daily resources to make up for that. Either, healing surges or daily abilities, things like that. They are emergency corrective abilities. These are. Everything else should either be something you can do at will or something you can do every encounter. And so you can design encounter difficulty such that on average, you probably need to spend 1 daily ability each fight. Then you can have adventuring days that are as long as you want, and it still more or less works out. If you have one encounter adventure days, it's still going to be easier because you have more, because every character has daily abilities that they can drop. And if you're dropping more than 1 daily ability, it's probably going to be a lot easier. Or you could even design it such that each player should, on average, have to spend 1 daily ability, and then you can balance the adventuring day that way. That would really work out. Like if you can get the math to work this way. And I'm not saying that it's easy to do so. You have some fairly fine margins and so many variables. I'm not saying I could do it, but I'm saying that it kind of has been done, and not in 5th edition. So I think the adventuring day is A, problematic, B, it doesn't work even under assumed perfect circumstances. And other people have talked about this a lot. It doesn't work because non-spellcasters run out of hit points faster than spellcasters run out of spell slots. Especially if you have any melee characters, they tend to get absolutely chunked. Being a melee character costs more resources than being a ranged character, and that's just the facts. Because you have to either, spend healing surges, or not healing surges, hit dice. You just spend hit dice. You have to spend spell slots on healing, preventative spells like silvery barbs to protect them from getting hit, those kinds of things. And I don't know. I've just been frustrated by the whole idea of the adventuring day. It's actually, that was the very first thing that turned me off of running games when this is back in 2014. Like 5th edition just came out, and I'm reading through the Dungeon Master's Guide on how to build encounters. Because as I've said before, I run fully custom campaigns. When I run a game, I run it in my home world, my custom setting. And I build all encounters by hand. And I was looking at the math on how to build encounters and how to run the adventuring day. And because of the number of things that I had to concern myself with, not only like each individual encounter needs to be like this XP budget based on the level of the party, which is not an easy to remember algorithm either. There's a minor annoyance there, but also each adventuring day has an XP budget. And like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of stuff to keep track of. And if I waver outside of that, I thought at the time, then things are not going to really work out that well. And as it turns out, they don't work out that well either way. So it doesn't really matter. But the guidelines just put a lot of burden on the DM to make sure that you stay within these specific guidelines for both each encounter and the adventuring day. All for it to not work out anyways. So I think the adventuring day is an inherently flawed idea, and it is much better to run systems that don't really lean hard on the idea of the adventuring day. 4th edition does this. Basically, any narrative-based game does this. Pathfinder does this. These are systems where it gives you greater freedom to tell the stories the way you want to tell them, rather than being straitjacketed into 6 to 8 combat encounters per day, or resource draining encounters, I should say. I guess it's not technically always combat encounters. If you spend a spell slot to get through an obstacle, that counts. It's just way too restrictive. Even if the math worked, it would be too restrictive. Putting on top of that the math does not work, it's a bad situation, and I'll have no part of it. This is why I don't run 5th edition. I have run a total of one shot of 5th edition, and I think, did I try to run I think I tried to run a campaign very early on, and I just got frustrated with how much work I had to do. This is coming right off the tail of 4th edition, so you understand, like, I don't want to do that much work. 4th edition is a dream to run, by the way. It is the most DM-friendly version of D&D by a long margin. So I have very little tolerance for systems that require me as the game runner, the game master, to do a lot of work.